So did you play Dragon's Lair a lot when you were a young strapping lad?
A fair amount, yes.
What was do you recall about what your largest nightly expenditure was on that game?
No, not too much. So I actually played it more on console, which was a big step down because the console games, understandably for the time, reworked it into like a side-scrolling platform game.
Yeah, for any of our viewers who are not using walkers, we probably should explain Dragon's Lair. Well, it was something in my youth I was familiar with. It kind of like saying, "How about a mastodon? Did you like mastodons?" Um, Dragon's Lair was one of the first, if not the first, laser disc based arcade game where it was a kind of choose your own adventure, but if you made certain choices, you died. And you were a knight trying to rescue a princess. And you would be presented with rooms. You could jump left, you could jump right, you could go forward, you could go back. And depending on the choices you made, you would go and you would die. And you had so many lives. It's a lot of levels and it's a lot of moves per each level. And it gets a little tricky. So there's a lot of memorization involved and a little bit of timing as well. But it's a fun game. It was really fun, but it really was well designed to pull a lot of money out of your pocket and put it into their pocket. Followed later by Space Ace, same kind of concept. Oh, I still think Dragon's Lair is superior in my opinion, just in terms of maybe it's because it's the first. But
I like
so
both, but I always like Dragon's Lair a little better.
so from a console standpoint, what console version of Dragon's Lair did you play?
So NES, so I played it in the arcades first, and then I remember playing the NES game. Mostly, I think I initially rented it because I didn't understand how that could possibly translate to NES. And then I learned it's because it's not really the same game. They just took the characters and made a side-scrolling game out of it, which isn't terrible, but they should have called it something else. Not that I expected it to look like the arcade game. I didn't know what to expect from it, but it's so drastically different at that point. I also played it on Game Boy, the OG black and white Game Boy.
Yeah, there's a Game Boy Color version. What we really wanted to kind of talk a little bit about tonight was the Game Boy Color version of it, which is the game. It's a pretty darn close approximation of the game. And so there's the whole math problem of how do you take a laser disc based game, taking Don Bluth animations and um, doing your choose your own adventure thing with them, and how do you convert that onto it's usually a 4 MB, sometimes eight cartridge, and obviously for Dragon's Lair it was an 8 MB cartridge. How do you do that? And how brilliant do you need to be to do that? Well, you need to be as brilliant as Digital Eclipse, who we've already determined is pretty brilliant with their roles in other things that we've talked about on this show, like the Atari 50th collection. So they were the ones that did it. I'm a little fuzzy on the idea. I was doing some research, like we like to do for the Panda Army, and I believe the Game Boy Color version was developed in 2000 and released in 2001. I think those are dates, but I got a little fuzziness on that as I went through. And then I was
Sounds about
pricing
right.
it, does it? Yeah, and I was pricing it, and that's super interesting there because you will see it run from 20 to 25 bucks up to $500 on eBay. Some of those people say, I've got this magic thing. Now, maybe I'm assuming there was the game, maybe it's the Game Boy version. I'm not sure what they're looking to do if it was the black and white version, but Game Boy Color version is, I think, pretty remarkable in terms of how closely they did. Now they fudged where they needed to when they realized they couldn't get it all on there. So like some of the backgrounds, which would have had a lot more texture, have a lot less texture on that. But they came up with several compression mechanisms. But it is outstanding. And I don't know why. I mean, obviously, I wasn't a big Game Boy Color purchaser back in the day in terms of games. And so I had, I clearly was unaware of it because had I been playing it with some regularity and I knew there was a Dragon's Lair out there, I would have grabbed that right away. So I guess to a certain degree, this is a skip it, buy it thing. And for me, I'm not going to buy it on eBay where I'll spend hundreds of dollars to get the cartridge. But if I can find maybe at Outlaw Video Games, who knows? Um, uh, that if I can find it at a good price, I will be buying it. So because I think that looks like a fine use for Game Boy Color. So where are you at that? Would you want to get this version of Dragon's Lair for your Game Boy Color?
Yeah, I mean, of course, I could play a legally sourced backup ROM through my EverDrive for my Game Boy Color. But I think this is one that's probably worth having a physical cartridge of to be able to show off what it can do and really appreciate it for what it is. Game Boy Color did so I skipped Game Boy Color as a console when it was initially released. I had Game Boy. I had a nice library of games for that, and then I jumped to Game Boy Advance. I kind of skipped Game Boy Color because, and this is how Nintendo really sells it now, that Game Boy Color was just Game Boy in color. That's really how they pitch it. That's how they did it at the time, and that's nowadays when you look at sales numbers, they combine Game Boy and Game Boy Color. What I didn't know at the time, and I didn't learn until I was playing Game Boy Advance because that was backwards compatible, and there were still a few Game Boy Color games popping up here and there. I ended up picking one up on a whim, and it was Resident Evil Gaiden for Game Boy Color, and that game was amazing. It was so much more advanced than anything I imagined on Game Boy Color or not. So I didn't understand how that was happening. So looking back into it, Game Boy Color actually was a lot more powerful than OG Game Boy was. It had more RAM in there, and they had also had larger capacity cartridges to go along with the color and the more RAM and everything else. So, I mean, it wasn't, again, it's insanely impressive that this is working the way that it is on there. So it wasn't, comparable to the consoles at the time, but compared to the original Game Boy, it was a pretty big step forward from that. And I don't know why Nintendo downplayed that at the time. Now I understand why they do it. So they can lump the sales numbers together and now Game Boy sold 200 million units or whatever it is. So I get it now, but at the time I don't know why they didn't push harder on this idea that Game Boy Color was much more powerful than the original Game Boy was.
That's a fair point. And there was no night trap for Game Boy Color though, right? That's what
No, there is for Game Boy Advance.
there
I
is.
have
Yeah.
that. But if you're interested in some other anybody who's watching interested in some other really impressive Game Boy Color games, Resident Evil Gaiden is amazing looking. Alone in the Dark on Game Boy Color, it's not the best way to play Alone in the Dark by any stretch of the imagination, but the fact that it looks as good as it does, and it's kind of similar to this, where you're just kind of awed by what you're seeing happening on there. Again, it doesn't play as good as say Resident Evil Gaiden or this though.
So is it the Virtual Boy version that you recommend for that game? Is that the
For
preferred
playing
console?
Alone in the Dark.
Yes, for Alone in the Dark.
Alone in the Dark, if I was going to recommend an Alone in the Dark to anybody, original PC Alone in the Dark from like 90, 91, whatever, like early 90s PC Alone in the Dark is the one that I would recommend. At the time, I remember that just blowing people's minds and playing it now. It's your character's like three polygons moving at a snail's pace across the screen. But I remember at the time people being like, this looks real. Like this you're in the game. It's insane. It's like a Lego brick man moving at a snail's pace.
It was the same sense of suspension of disbelief that you get with, oh, I don't know, Atari Golf. Those kinds of, so. See you on that. Hey, folks, we'd appreciate hearing from you if you're still playing Game Boy Color games, and if you are you do you have Dragon's Lair? And if you don't, are you going to follow our advice and purchase it? It does look really cool, but it's always been a favorite game of mine. So I think I gotta chase one down because that'll be fun. But I won't be doing it on eBay, so we'll do that. Hey, we'd also appreciate if you'd like and subscribe to the Bog Panda YouTube channel. Hit that bell so when you know when new stuff comes out. And new stuff comes out a lot, like once a day. Hard to know, the world's shortest podcast. So enjoy a few of those and then go over and download some commercially free. I don't know if that's right. Some free ROMs that are available, completely legal to use, of the Slapdash variety for the Game Boy, and a couple other goodies for you out there as well, including some Doom 2 levels for you to enjoy. So, anything else for this show, sir?
No, I think that about covers it.
Thanks for watching, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Bog Panda.